Hey, what's up, Internet? Long time no see. Let's talk about 3.16 and Scourge League because I've got some updates to Freezing Pulse. I don't think I'm going to be playing it this league, but I did want to get it updated because a lot of people have asked me if I was going to do that, and I know some people were playing it in 3.15 and still enjoyed it. Um, and I want to talk about the changes coming to Freezing Pulse in all the builds. With the passive tree changes, and then talk a little bit about my own league starter. This is by and large going to be like a path of building video. So if you're looking for like a Freezing Pulse total guide, you're not going to find it here. I'm going to be talking about the changes coming to Freezing Pulse, and I'll be updating my Freezing Pulse guide on the forums if you want to read that and read the changes there. By the time you see this video, most of those have already happened. I haven't quite finished the leveling section notes update, but by and large the build is leveling the same with Holy Flame Totem. In fact, let's jump into PoB now, and we'll start with the Holy Flame Totem tree, because I'm sure, as you're aware by now, one of the biggest changes in 3.16 is going to be a revamp of the passive tree with the addition of these masteries. Now, by and large, I feel like they don't totally upend the passive tree. I think Chris was telling the truth about that. They do change our plans in the early game, though. And one thing that definitely changed for Holy Flame Totem was the Avatar of Fire. So they've tossed Avatar of Fire way down here. It's really just not worth trekking down here anymore. This is way too many points to get to Avatar of Fire. So, thankfully in Fire Mastery, we can get 40% conversion to fire damage. So with a little bit of rerouting, we can still basically have the same game plan for the campaign. You're going to start in Hyro, come through life, get these nodes, get down here. I think one thing we'd probably change actually is to just get the life mastery earlier. Let me just put that on there. The plus 50 to maximum life mastery is really strong, and the earlier you can get that, the more potent it's going to be relative. So this is kind of a priority, but you'll still come up through here and grab like Divine Fury. Divine Fury will open up the elemental mastery. This one's not super important. I went with 10% physical as extra damage of a random element, but you can take the elemental res early on. If you find yourself needing, elemental res, maybe after the first Kitava or something, or even just take it really early. But otherwise, things are basically the same. Like, Ancestral Bond doesn't have lead-ins anymore, and they moved this Primal Manifestation up here, connected to the same point. This used to be the one right about here. And it's not like an amazing wheel, but it does give us access to Totem Mastery. This will give us the ability to add totems taunting for 1 second when you summon them, which will make the campaign even easier, right? Like, you can just... your totems are going to taunt every time you summon a new one, and the campaign was already pretty easy. This just makes your life even simpler. You're still not going to take Ancestral Bond until you can get multiple totems, which is in like Act 4. But for the most part, the only change is this route here, where in Purity of Flesh, you're going to come out this way instead of up here, because we're going to need to get to this Fire Mastery. So we'll just come through here, get this Explosive Impact, get the Fire Mastery for conversion, and we'll pick up Dark Art. Since we're coming out this way, this will be like a pretty good damage node while you're leveling, provided you're using 2 wands. If you're leveling with a shield, you have to find some of these, probably like down here in Divine Judgment or something. Otherwise, it's the same deal. Come down, get Mind Over Matter later. You come up here for mana and life. This looks kind of weird, the pathing, but that's just sort of a side effect of how they move things around. Shaman's Dominion is now over here, so there's no real reason to come up here anymore. We don't need Elemental Overload. Elemental Overload, if you use the level with this, they changed it so that it only applies to the skill that actually triggers it. even if, like, you can try this in the patch and see if totems can trigger this. The way it's worded makes me think maybe it can. It would be cool if it worked with totems. Then it might be worth coming up this way instead of down here. Remains to be seen. If it does work with totems, though, it'll be nice because it only buffs the skills that actually crit and trigger it now. So like if Wave of Conviction crit, it would only buff Wave of Conviction. If this does work with totems, it's probably worth taking early on, though. We don't take Mystic Bulwark anymore for mana because they took the mana off of it. they just deleted it. So we come over here to get Arcane Will from the top. There's an extra travel point on Arcane Will now. There's really no way around it. So coming over here to get directly into Prodigal Perfection makes a little bit more sense because it allows us to take the entire mana line from the top. Otherwise, we just come over through Arcane, Firewalker, Life, and such. And this 88 points, this is right about when you'd finish the story. So this is like the whole tree through the campaign if you were playing Holy Flame Totem. We don't have like our jewel sockets. Usually you don't wind up needing your jewel sockets in the campaign. As for Freezing Pulse, this is the high end of the tree. Oops. This one. This is like a level 96 tree, but this would be an example of still being in the Kikuzaru setup. And as you can see, it's not actually very different in terms of like the general shape. The Asylum Wheel, which we used to use in like 3.14 that they added it, or 3.13, when we no longer need to come down to Sanctum of Thought, which is good because we don't want to come down here anymore anyway. But this Asylum Wheel got moved over here into this new travel point, and it's actually quite strong because it's like Chaos Res and Reduced Effective Curses. Both of them go up to 30%. So you get 30% Chaos Res and 30% Curse Effect for 4 points, or for 3 points. And then you spend one on the Mastery and get another 20% Reduced Effective Curses. So with this Mastery change, we get 50% Reduced Effective Curses for 4 points. Now, they also changed Kikuzaru to where it now goes up to 60% Reduced Effective Curses on you. Now, so we don't need to run 2 Kikuzarus ever again. Just Asylum with the Mastery, and this gives us 110% reduction minimum. This can obviously still be catalyzed up to 72. So, in a way, this patch is going to wind up buffing the earlier side of Freezing Pulse, because now we can get an Essence Worm and throw Hatred or Zealotry into it, even on a Kikuzaru. We don't need to wait for a Viridi's Veil or anything like that. So this build would have been... We actually gained a decent chunk of damage, I have to say, from the Mastery stuff because of that change. Right? Like, I think this was closer to like 1.7 million in this gear or something like that at 6 totems. So it's still not really that impressive. Like, we do have in the PoB, there's some stuff like a Pandemonious in here. Nothing crazy. It's like a 6-link, some decent rares, and like a Pandemonious is probably the one like kind of expensive item. But still, it's 2 million, which will feel okay clearing red maps, but 2 million doesn't feel great for something like Cirrus. And you still really want to support this build, I think, with Ice Spear for your single target, if you want to invest into it around the time of like your first Cirrus kill, and then content beyond that. Right when you're first getting to Cirrus is when you're going to feel that lack of single target the most. If you're playing a build like this for League Start, and you're just looking for a build that like gets through the campaign easily, gets you into maps, and you just want to farm like mid yellows to like low reds, this build is still really, really good for that. No issues here, and it got even better compared to 3.15 in that specific context. If you're looking to invest into the build, I mean, it's definitely a little bit stronger than it used to be in 3.15, but it's still really nowhere near where it was before the big nerfs in 3.5. If we look at This was like my ultimatum character converted to 3.16. So this is like a pretty high-end investment. We're doing like 9.5 million with freezing pulse during clear, and about 22 million if we switch to freezing pulse or to ice spear for single target. Those are pretty good numbers, but there is quite a bit invested into this character, right? We have like a 2-mod Watcher's Eye, an enchanted Viridi's Veil, 2 really sick wands, 6-link Soul Mantle that corrupted with +2 projectile gems, 21, 23 gems on both, Culling Strike, this Puaharte's gloves. So these are Puaharte's with Warlord Culling Strike. Really nice boots with 40% ailment effect. This was back when Cult Conduction was a thing. Obviously the Whispers of Doom Pandemonious. A really nice Brutal Restraint. There's quite a bit of money in this character. So this is like a pretty high end. It's not like a theoretical maximum, for sure. But for most people, this would probably be at least a month of work on the build, right? For like your somebody who isn't trying to play this game for 40 plus hours a week. So with that kind of investment, this isn't necessarily the most impressive thing you could do with that currency. Now, it's still, at this level of investment, if you really want to, it's going to feel great for mapping. Like, it's absolutely going to do whatever you want. It'll even do content like the Feared and Maven and stuff handily. The only thing I'm not as sure about is content like the new tier of Uber content they're adding, right? There's Blight Ravaged maps, there's the Uber Domain of Conflict for Legion, the new tier of Breachstones. I would assume that something like 22 million single target, even though I don't think you're ever really getting this with Ice Spear. You're probably getting like, maybe 75% of that. That should be enough for something like a Breachstone. I don't know about something like Domain of Timeless Conflict. I don't necessarily know about like the Uber Blight maps. You would think that even if we're just doing Freezing Pulse, we'd be okay in there. But I'm less confident about saying like you're gonna feel good investing this amount of currency, way over 100 exalts, way over, and then getting this, level of damage and survivability, right? Because I think survivability is going to be a big concern. Domain of Timeless Conflict, for example, scales its enemy's damage in a new way, right? So they're going to get more and more powerful offensively as you kill them. And in a build like this, where we have a really vulnerable to physical damage in particular, that's going to be a really hard sell, I think. And I don't know if it's going to feel great to invest that much and still feel like, that content is content you'd have to sell to somebody. If you're not going to do that content, if you're going to play the content that existed in 3.15 or before, I mean, this is still a perfectly fine end goal to shoot for, right? 10 million DPS while clearing and the option to slot in very easily, right? Like, this is the lazy version. We have Rain of Splinters in all the time, and you just swap in GMP and Ice Spear, I think, for like Hypothermia and Freezing Pulse. So it's not like there was some big inconvenience. And then in the masteries look pretty much the same. We have like a critical multiplier against bosses and crit mastery. We have the taunt totems, and then I took 60% global crit strike when you summoned. You kind of have to take this mastery if you want to undo. They nerfed Shaman's Dominion a little bit. This used to be 100% crit strike, 20% multiplier when you summoned a totem or something like that. And so to get the crit back, you have to take this mastery. You could just sacrifice that crit, especially in the way that I have the build for like Ice Spear. And you could take something like Totem Placement Range, which is actually pretty cool. This will allow you to place your totems really far away, and then combined with Totem Taunt, you'd be a lot safer overall. You could also take like 5% of damage from hits, gets transferred to a totem. I would not take the chance to summon 2 totems at 30%. This is more for the build I'm going to talk about in a second. Like for ballistas, we don't summon enough totems where this makes any sense to spend a skill point doing. So I would take the crit chance by default, and then maybe consider taking totem placement range instead. So not a whole lot's changing. I'll obviously have all of the PoBs I've shown you in the Freezing Pulse thread on the forums, which will be linked in the description. Both the leveling and the high-end version. It's still a good build, but I still think you can feel the damage of 3.15's like support gem nerfs in that build, and I'm not sure if you are okay with it in 3.5. I think you'll be even happier with it in 3.16, but I'm still hesitant to. I'm more hesitant to recommend it to people than I used to be, right? And I'm not going to league start at this league. I'm instead going to try to play some ballista stuff at league start. I had, if you've been watching my stream last league, you know that I had planned to play some ballista stuff, and just I really didn't enjoy the patch, despite kind of enjoying the expedition mechanic. And so this league I'm just going to start with ballistas and force my way into it. I don't have a build guide for this yet, and I'm not going to do that until I have a better way to level this. Like I remember when I first made my Freezing Pulse guide in Legion, and me and everybody else who tried to follow that guide learned pretty quickly that leveling as Freezing Pulse totems isn't really that great. Like you really were lacking in single target, and it didn't feel great until you got to that second labyrinth. And then once you got your 4th ascendancy point, you were like, oh, okay, things are okay now. Once we figured out leveling the Holy Flame totem was so much better, we kind of erased that problem, right? I don't have a similar analog for this build. I don't have a good way, like Holy Flame totem, to level in a way that kind of would make sense with this tree, but doesn't suck until second lab. That's sort of just how it feels. It reminds me a lot of trying to level with Freezing Pulse back in the day. But I will say that it also reminded me of old Freezing Pulse in the sense that the progression felt smoother. Once you're on the other side of that second lab, it reminded me a lot more of the power curve that I was happier with, in terms of each piece adding a significant step of damage, and you could more clearly see the thread of progress. There also isn't really, you know, when it came to, especially at Ziri's Reflection, and then later it got a little bit better with Viridi's Veil, there was that big wall you would hit, right, item-wise, where until you got that one item, your damage scaling kind of plateaued from the tree. With the Iron Commander Siege Ballista setup, it feels like a much smoother and like incremental curve to your progression, and that reminded me a lot of what it felt like to level the old Freezing Pulse build. The concept behind this build, if you've never seen it, is we take this Iron Commander bow, and basically this says with every 200 dexterity you get +1 maximum siege ballistas. So we're going to stack as much dex as we can and add a bunch of ballistas, and then try to add other mechanics that reward us for stacking those stats. So with the Hiri's Demise, which is like a prophecy quiver, which is a prophecy upgrade from a really cheap quiver, this gives us some attributes, and then gives us a bunch of elemental damage per 10 stat. So cold damage for dexterity, fire damage for strength, and lightning damage for intelligence. Obviously we're focused on dexterity, but we're gonna, just on the way of getting dexterity, we're gonna wind up stacking a bunch of other stats too. Like this item has 30 all attributes and not just dexterity, right? So this is a big chunk of our damage. We stack so many stats, like this, you can see if I remove this would be like 38% damage loss or something. We'll add that to a Fractal Thoughts. So this is giving us critical strike multiplier if our dexterity is higher than our int, which it is always going to be, and then 15% dexterity if our strength is higher than our intelligence, which it also we can guarantee. Then it also gives us 1% elemental damage per 10 dex. This build, even as it is, has 1400 dex. So this is giving me 140 increased elemental damage. So you can start to see these mechanics that are scaling our stat stacking really starting to pile up, right? We've got like a Hiri's Ire. This is mainly for like evasion and the damage to bow attacks. And now it's also got chance to suppress spell damage. Spell damage, or the suppression, is a new mechanic that is essentially replacing the spell dodge mechanic. There's still a way to convert suppression into spell dodge, but they just kind of removed dodge from the game entirely, and they replaced it with spell suppression, which is like a chance to cut a spell's damage in half. Well, with the Mage Bane, we get 1% chance to suppress spell damage for every 15 dexterity. Well, we're going to stack tons of that, and so as you can see, I actually have 100% spell suppression. And that basically happened with a single point, right? Because we have so much dex. We also, like, the downside of this is that our evasion rating no longer provides a multiplier to our evasion. Well, the Iron Reflexes node also has that downside. Dexterity no longer provides bonus to evasion. Well, since we already have that penalty, this really just becomes a decision. Do I want evasion or armor? And I've decided, at least for now, to try and convert all of my evasion into armor. The reason being is that this is going to allow us to scale Molten Shell for our guard skill instead of something like Steel Skin. Altogether, with all these dex stacking mechanics, we wind up with quite a lot of armor, which turns into a pretty fat guard skill, right? It's like 6.3k. For, you know, if you compare that to Freezing Pulse Totem, if you're using Steel Skin, you're usually getting like a 2k shield. So we get the benefit of fat armor, and then we have this guard skill, which can protect us from hits from something like elemental damage too. And then we have spell suppression, which is going to block essentially half of all spell damage, as long as it has a hit component, right? It'll also cut the damage of an ailment that came from an elemental hit, like Ignite. It'll cut that in half too, if it was caused by the hit. Otherwise, we're just sort of trying to stack Siege Ballista damage through dexterity and cold multipliers. So, you know, we take like cold mastery down here. We're converting our physical into cold to try and scale cold better. We take obviously the attribute bonus, and then we take, you know, more dexterity per mastery allocated. Lethality has the projectile mastery, which has this crazy 1% projectile damage for every 16 dexterity. So yet again, getting rewarded for stacking dexterity. And then we take some totem nodes. This one gives us 150 flat armor for every totem. We're currently in this setup. This is a pretty conservative setup, by the way. And we have 1400 dex. So we have 14 total ballistas that we're getting 150 flat armor before multipliers. As you can see, this counts currently for about 4.5k armor when I'm at max ballistas. We get +1 ballista here, and then +1 ballista here. And then also 1% movement speed for summon totem. And then we have a couple of like armor and evasion multipliers. These are, I'm largely taking these because we're using a lot of uniques at first, and these all have resists on them. Like we take the other evasion that also grants like 12 all res between the 2 points. This one grants 16 all res. This one that we come through grants 10% all res, and then this one grants 12 all res. So we're looking for ways to increase our elemental res while we're increasing our armor evasion. And the two masteries here, evasion mastery and the hybrid armor and evasion mastery, which are different, they both grant a bunch of armor, right? Like this one grants us evasion per frenzy and endurance charge. We get frenzies from actually using the frenzy skill. We're always going to have endurance charges up. This is 6,500 armor just for the 1 point. This one doubles the evasion of our body armor. This one doesn't currently work in PoB, but we can simulate that by just doubling our evasion rating from our body armor, right? Which is like 2844. Because it's like a flat, you know, it's just doubling that value. This winds up being like over 7,000 armor. So these mastery points are just really good for defense, and you can see how they've really increased the value of these core defensive mechanics, right? Like I've only got 2 points invested here, and 2 points, I guess 3 with the mastery. So 3 points and 3 points, and I have, you know, some uniques on by and large, and I've got over 30,000 armor. So, and if I take it off, if I didn't want Iron Reflexes, I could do that and have 60% evade and just lower armor. That could prove to be the way that I prefer playing. We'll have to get in there and see, because this would allow us to use blind to a little bit of effect too, but we'd have to do some kind of better guard skill scaling after that. And I kind of just want to lower our maximum hit taken, because since we're Hyro, we're scaling all this life regen per totem, and we're going to continue to try and scale our decks up beyond this. But even at 14 totems, that's 14% life per second. So we kind of have our sustain covered, and we're just looking to increase our EHP via mitigation. As you can see, this is like 5.5 million with 14 totems, and I really don't feel like anything is particularly nutty here. Like, most of these uniques are really cheap, even at League Start. Garukan's Flight is probably the most expensive unique here. It didn't actually, it seemed like it spiked in Ultimatum much later. Like, this started out at like 100 chaos, and then it started to slink, and then it went back up because somebody like 8 weeks into the league or something, I think, made a video that involved it or something like that. But in general, this is probably the most, it's like having a Pandemonius basically, and it's probably going to be cheaper than that this league. Astramentus I also would expect is going to have more competition this league, but it's just not that rare of an amulet. Usually this is like 10 to 20C, and even if the stat stacking strength boys, like the Inquisitors and stuff, who are going to show up, I think, in larger numbers in 3.16, come after this amulet. This is like a target farmable item, because there's a card called the Polymath that drops in Relic Chambers, and I think it still drops in Act 5 and Act 10 Reliquary too, that card. Probably not very often, but having target farm ways kind of guarantees that the price of this can't get out of control. But everything else, like Hiri's Ire, we don't need a 6-link on this. We're going to be using like Frenzy, and so like something like faster attacks or Culling Strike, just take it out. Increased critical strikes, you can take that out too. We're just using it to cast on crit, Frost Bomb, and Sniper's Mark. We don't need huge crit rates to do that consistently, because we don't need these to go off like every second, right? We're just basically using it to get frenzies and sometimes debuff bosses. And then we've got some Hatred and Skitterbots with Bone Chill. The gameplay is really simple, and I'll have more gameplay of this build when we do the League Start Diary stuff. But I did a test run of this, and I like it for how smooth it winds up playing. It reminds me a lot of like my older Freezing Pulse totem builds, in terms of you're just kind of running around and dropping totems, and sometimes right-clicking, right, and dashing or something like that. So this single target feels like it gets more, like the scaling is just more rewarding per currency investment, because this build is probably cheaper than the 2 million Freezing Pulse that I showed you, and I could easily get this over 20 million with that kind of high level investment. Easily get this over 20 million, and it would still clear with the same skill. It wouldn't be 20 million in single target and then half that or less while clearing. It would be that all the time. So I'm looking forward to trying it out and hope it works out. I know that the League Start is going to be a lot rougher than usual for me, just because I don't have a good way to level this yet. But everything on the other side of the second lab is going to be fun, I think. So if you are interested to watch me level this, I will be doing that in just a couple days here. It's currently Wednesday. We've got 2 more days until League Start starts at noon Pacific. And as usual, I'll be doing my League Start videos every day, at least for the first like week or so, because I'm going to have a lot of thoughts, I'm sure, about how to better progress that build once it's in motion. I'll try to have the leveling notes for the forum thread for like the Holy Flame totem leveling stuff also updated sometime before League Start here if I can. And yeah, I think I'm going to wrap it up here so this video doesn't get insanely long. I've got more thoughts on Scourge, but I'll probably save those for League Start stream and just more videos once I get to play with the Scourge mechanic. I definitely have some money-making thoughts rattling around that I'll probably make videos on very quickly, especially when it comes to the Scourge mechanic. I think we're going to be seeing a lot of corrupted 6-links and ways to gear up your own character much more easily than people think. I don't think Scourge is quite as like RNG to use necessarily as people are expecting. I think there's going to be some pretty consistent ways to get value. But we'll find out on Friday. So feel free to stop by. It's twitch.tv/WallachTV if you're interested. Make sure to hit all the YouTube buttons. YouTube loves that. And I'll see you guys Friday for League Start. Peace.